All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'd like to take a moment and ask you all to put yourselves on mute and to make sure that you put your name and where you're from in the chat. It is my pleasure. My name is Amanda Young. I am the tech host for today for your session. So I will be running the chat and helping out with any of the links that go into the chat. But you are in the Equity, Justice, and Activism, Why This Matters to White Students session. And it is my pleasure to introduce Leigh Erickson. Erickson is an educator, activist, and author of What is White Privilege, has taught in New York City, Chicago, rural Ohio, and Mount Vernon, Iowa. She is a finalist for the 2019 Iowa Teacher of the Year and aims to eradicate racism through justice-driven teaching with a focus on educating white students and adults. Erickson is the founder of Undone Consulting and the Undone Movement, a nationwide movement of racial reconciling. Grateful to play a small role in century-long resistant work, she owes much to her family, friends, and mentors. So I will let her take it away from here.
Thank you so much. I am so excited to be here. And if you're wondering what took me from New York City to Iowa, it was love. I fell in love with an Iowan in New York, and he took me to the motherland, as he likes to call it. So here I am in Iowa, teaching and consulting and raising 4 little boys. And I am so grateful to be here to have this conversation. When Dr. Barber said this morning that we must teach the nation in order to change the nation, I think that is so particularly and uniquely important for white students. And I'm really excited to talk about why I think that is and why we have such a responsibility to address these students specifically when it comes to equity and race and how to do that as well. So thank you so much for having me here. So today in our 45 minutes, we have some big goals and we'll do our best, but I'm hoping that we can really understand why justice-driven curriculum matters for white students and determine how you can implement changes to your teaching that are good for students and good for you. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. And finally, gain some tools to face the challenges that arise in equity work. As we know, they exist on a personal level, on a community level, and on a national level with state and national policy that's going out right now. So we're going to talk about the why, the how, and the trials. So I do want to make sure that we set the context for today with an overview of disparities that exist in education and really an encouragement to you for being a justice-driven educator. This work matters. Lives are on the line. And I'm so, so thankful that you're here to learn, that we can learn together and grow together. I'm really hopeful and assuming that I'll learn from all of you guys as well. Next, I really want to talk about the how, some steps that you can take right now in your classroom to help you and your students cultivate a culture of equity and belonging that they can then take into the world. And finally, the trials. We'll just have some advice on navigating some personal and professional and community stress that will arise. I say may, but let's be honest, right? Will arise as you engage in this work. So I want to talk about the segregation of our schools, and the segregation landscape of our schools really doesn't look a whole lot different than it did when Brown versus the Board of Ed was passed. So right now, greater than 50% of students in the United States attend a school in which 75% or more of the population is white or non-white. So we're talking segregated spaces. And I've taught in those spaces as well. Right now, I've been in a segregated white space, a very predominantly white space, but I've been in spaces in other schools. The school I taught in Chicago was 100%, racial demographic was 100% Black. So I've seen different ways in which our school districts are segregated. Right now, 80% of America's public school teaching staff identify as white, but if you break that down and even further, you're going to see that number grow. So right now, only 7% of our teaching staff identify as Black, and only 2% of our teaching staff in the United States identify as Black men. And so while we have that 80% number, look at that difference in the student population number. 48% of students enrolled in public school identify as white. So we have a large gap there in representation. And finally, and I think we really do need to sit with this statistic, 40% of America's schools, 40%, nearly half of America's schools do not have a single teacher of color on staff. That was my experience at Mount Vernon until this year. They just hired their first educator of color. So I actually want to just pause right here because those are some really big statistics, and have a chat in the chat box. What is the impact of this racial isolation? What do you see being the impact of this racial isolation? And we can actually, that can be in the chat, or if the raise hand feature is available and you want to share verbally, I am totally okay with that too. Thank you, Rebecca. I see loneliness, anger, and despair. Absolutely. I really want to pause and think about how this reality of the makeup of our schools is impacting our students, is impacting our educators. So share your thoughts in the chat, or feel free to raise your hand and share out loud. Children grow up to become the jobs they see themselves in. If they don't see themselves in education, they won't grow up to be educators. Yes, I am fortunate to be on the Build for Equity team, and that is a primary problem in the educator pipeline is lack of representation, not being able to see oneself as an educator. As an educator of color, I am tokenized. Thank you so much for sharing that in vulnerability. I really appreciate that. And it's absolutely something that we see in another major problem that's been coming up in the conversations about the pipeline: isolation, loss of sense of self-esteem. Yes, kids of color don't learn as well. Absolutely. Research shows that even if students of color have even one teacher of color in elementary school, I believe it is, they are exponentially more likely to be successful in school, to graduate high school, to go on to post-secondary learning, to score better on tests. Lack of empathy. Yes, white students do experience a lack of empathy. Absolutely. Voices of color are unheard or being called divisive or controversial. This is, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And we're here to have the conversation that because of this isolation, we as educators, because of this segregation, we as educators have a responsibility to desegregate the education experience. And so I don't want to just present this problem to you and say, wow, this is a terrible problem. What can you do? But I want to present this problem to you and say, there are things we can do. We can desegregate the education experience, even beyond just desegregate or diversifying our curriculum. I think we need to think outside the box, really diversify the experience. Please do continue to share and talk. So here's my charge to you, especially when we consider white students. We are sending students out into the world to live and work within the systems that exist. Therefore, we have a responsibility to steward their education in a way that allows them to build and be part of systems and communities that are centered on belonging. If we do not address implicit bias, micro and macro aggression, right? If we do not address internalized racism in our white students, they will carry that into our communities. They will carry that into our workspaces, which is why I feel so strongly that this work is so critical. So that is my charge to you. Help them do this now in school so that they can be part of rebuilding systems to be more equitable. And I use that word belonging, and I really want to be clear about what I mean by this word belonging. Hey, look up Dr. John Powell, a phenomenal educator and researcher who talks a lot about belonging and isolation. So belonging, he says, or being fully human. So when we talk about belonging, we really are talking about being fully human. It means more than just having access. It means more than just being allowed to walk into the school building. It means more than just being allowed to interview for the job, right? And we can talk about that word allowed too, and who holds the space to allow, right? But belonging really entails being respected at a basic level. That includes the right to both co-create and make demands on society, right? Co-create and make demands on society. And yes, Anne, I couldn't agree more. Belonging carries such dignity, and dignity different than respect. Dignity is not earned. Dignity is innate. We hold dignity, right? So are we uplifting the dignity of the students in our classroom, or are we denying their personal dignity? Are we actually harming them by not acknowledging their dignity? So I love this definition of belonging. I think it's a great anchor for our work today. And I think looking up Dr. Powell's work is a great idea. And just one more point about belonging. So if we look at this is a great resource, and you'll see the book at the bottom. It's called Belonging Through a Culture of Dignity. I recommended this book on my resource document for you as well. But this is what Dr. Powell and Cobb call the belonging gap. So what they're saying is that in schools, we are asking students to move from safety needs to achievement, and we don't recognize belonging. Or worse yet, we ask them to achieve in order to belong. But that if we actually focused on what it means to belong to the school community in an authentic way, and the students had the opportunity to do that, then we would be much more successful at providing opportunities for achievement. So we talked a little bit about what isolation looks like. So I would love to chat for a moment. Type a word or phrase now that describes what it would look like if our schools were actually centered on belonging. Yes, loving, community, joy, connections, happy, respect, peace. Yes, far less bullying. Yes. Safety, inclusivity, actual safety, right? Love, happy, inclusive, yes. So we see the segregated space that we're in. We see what we can achieve. I mean, who doesn't want to be in a space where these adjectives are actually true, right? Students feeling accepted, unafraid, empowered, yes, liberated is a word that often comes to mind when I think of a school like this. So let's work towards this belonging. So how do we do this? So I would argue that we do this by giving our students, and I really am talking about white students here, but there's some caveats, right? So we'll talk through that, but giving our students a fuller truth of a fuller humanity for a fuller joy. And this is applied to all students, a fuller truth of a fuller humanity for a fuller joy. So let's talk through each of those briefly. I always find myself returning to this quote by Bryan Stevenson, who's the author of Just Mercy, because I think sometimes we want to tell ourselves the unfortunate lie, and I really do feel it's unfortunate, that we are all just good, right? And when that desire to be good becomes an identity, then it prevents us from ever acknowledging the spaces in which we are weak. So a fuller truth for ourselves includes acknowledgement and vulnerability of the spaces in which we are weak. And I will always be the first in my classroom to acknowledge my weaknesses, to acknowledge the way that I'm working on my biases, to acknowledge the way in which I have harmed students because of unmitigated bias. Stevenson says, and here's the power, there is no power in being good. There is no power in that. But there is a power, a strength, a power even in understanding brokenness, because embracing our brokenness creates a need and a desire for mercy, and perhaps a corresponding need to show mercy. When you experience mercy, you learn things that are hard to learn otherwise. You see things you can't otherwise hear. You hear things you can't otherwise hear. And you begin to recognize the humanity that resides in each of us. If we do not feel that we need, and if we do not see how we have received grace and mercy, then it is very difficult to have empathy. It is very difficult to show grace and mercy to others because we feel superior. And that's not true. So let's cut out the idea of being good and let's embrace our brokenness. I think that's step one of truth, and helping students do that safely is so, so important. So that's part one of a fuller truth. And then I would say one of the most empowering things that I've experienced is learning a fuller truth about our history of systemic racism in the United States. And in my African American Lit class, we study that. We start with Stevenson's book, Just Mercy, and look at mass incarceration. And then we say, how did we get here? And we start with the rich history of people from the continent of Africa and move through the evolution of slavery to mass incarceration. And that has been eye-opening. What you'll see here are images from a civil rights tour that my students took. And we met with civil rights veterans here, Charles McLaurin, who worked with Amzie Moore and SNCC as we were visiting the Fannie Lou Hamer Memorial. So Charles McLaurin's in blue, and the man in the tan jacket next to him came over to us. He's in the neighborhood and said, "This man took my mother to try to register to vote 25 times. And if you know anything about working with SNCC and trying to get people registered to vote in Mississippi during the civil rights movement, you know that that was a life-threatening job." This is Catherine Brooks. She was a freedom rider and was arrested at this time. And this is Joanne Bland. She crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge on Bloody Sunday and Turnaround Tuesday as a 9-year-old. And she's here with our students asking us to pick up a piece of crumbled gravel from the space where the march started. And she said, "Think about the life you want for the people you love when you cross that bridge. We took you this far. Take us all the way this time." And so when we teach a fuller truth in our schools, then our students have a better understanding of the makeup of our nation. And that's a good thing. I remember there was a foreign exchange student in one of my classes in Mount Vernon, Iowa from Germany. And we started talking a little bit about World War II because of a reading that we were doing. And I remember he said, "Oh, I hate talking about this." And I can see all of my students kind of clench, thinking that somehow they've offended him by talking about something terrible that the nation of Germany participated in. But I knew that that wasn't what was going on, because I knew that was a very American perspective. And I said, "Finn, why do you hate talking about this?" And he said, "Because I love my country so much, and I am so angry to know that we caused this harm, and I want so much to do better." It is possible for both of those things to exist in the same places. And here's what happens when it doesn't. And I've said this before, so if you've heard me say it, I'm sorry, I'm saying it again. But let me tell you a little bit about my education experience and how that hurts students. So I grew up, and in my classes, I learned about slavery, but I didn't learn about the history of the people on the continent of Africa. I learned about the Civil War, but I didn't learn about the triumph and tragedy of Reconstruction. I learned about Jim Crow, but I didn't learn about the horrors of lynching. I learned about the Civil Rights Movement, but basically that it was MLK and the March on Washington. I didn't learn about Amzie Moore and Fannie Lou Hamer and Reverend Shuttlesworth. I learned about the war on drugs, but I didn't learn about mass incarceration. And when I've been given this incomplete history, I ultimately think that as a nation, we're good, because I'm not experiencing racism daily. So I think we're good. We're good, right? The problems in our past are dealt with, and they weren't really that bad anyway. And so I carry that mindset into my classrooms in Chicago. And suddenly, when I'm teaching about the civil rights movement, I don't understand why my classroom full of students of color are getting so angry. Because I don't understand their lived experience, because I don't understand the history of our nation. And learning that history absolutely changed my life and will absolutely change your lives. And whether you're in an English classroom, an elementary school classroom, a math classroom, you can do this, right? You can do this. It's the story problems you tell. It's the scientists you lift up. It's the books you read. It's the places you travel. You can do this wherever you are at. And it is critical, and it's empowering, because when students learn this history, they are empowered to make change. When students see how systems were built, they are empowered to change them. Because suddenly we don't exist in a society where things just are the way they are, because we teach them how they became the way that they are. And that is empowering. My students, after this tour, came home, developed K through 12 curriculum that they argued should be implemented mandatorily, took it before the superintendent, and I was blessed to be able to teach one of the classes that they created. This empowers them. Teach a fuller truth. Whew. All right. Next, teach a fuller truth of a fuller humanity. We have an absolutely problem with segregation in our schools. We have a huge problem with underrepresentation. So you need to diversify the education experience. We have a privilege as educators, right? We have a podium, we have a space. Let's give that space up. This is an example of that. I wanted to address this problem by making sure that every student of Mount Vernon had the opportunity to sit down and be taught by a person of color who was an expertise in his or her field. And so we started something called the CARE Conference, which stands for Connect, Absorb, Respond, and Empower. And what we did is students, we don't have school off on MLK Day, and that's a whole other story that we can get into. But what we did is on MLK Day, we had this conference where students were able to attend a variety of sessions. We had about 30 different people of color who were experts in various areas of expertise, from science and business and engineering to the arts. And students just went and followed their interests and were taught about that area of expertise by a person of color. And the idea is we want to help to destroy the monolith that we have created about people of color. And that monolith becomes even more intensified when you are in a school that is highly segregated, that is highly isolated, when you aren't building authentic relationships. And we do this for a fuller joy. So when I talk about authentic relationships, I really talk about authentic partnerships. We have an amazing partnership with the school that I taught at in Chicago called Collins Academy. It's really an amazing redemption story, I would say, in my own life. And so we visit students and students visit us, and we're not going to help or serve or volunteer. Let's not take our white students out into the community to help. That just continues to add to that narrative of disparity, right? But instead, we just spend time together. We would go to Chicago and go out to lunch and go to a museum and do a scavenger hunt and just spend time building relationships. In 2019, students from Collins Academy came to Iowa. We went on college tours. We went sledding. They taught us, they presented at the CARE conference. And some of these relationships that have been built are incredibly profound. The first time that I ever took students to Chicago, I had a girl who stayed for a volleyball tournament that weekend, and she came back to me on Monday and she said, "You know what, Mrs. Erickson, I'm not afraid of Black people anymore." One, she recognized that fear-based bias that we have, that isolation breeds, right? And through relationships, and she's not finished in her journey, certainly, but through relationships, she was able to eradicate some fear that she held. And that's powerful. Desegregate your school with authentic relationship building experiences. If you're a K through 12 educator, that might be .org actually. Empatico has an amazing program where you can partner up with a school somewhere else in the nation, sometimes somewhere else in the world, and just partner with that school and learn alongside together. That is an incredibly powerful way to create those authentic relationships. So we're teaching a fuller truth of a fuller humanity for a fuller joy. And I want to show you a little bit of, I think I missed something. No, maybe not. Okay, never mind. Well, we're going to get some student testimonies later. Okay, so there's the why. Let's talk a little bit about the how. So Brian Stevenson says there's 4 keys to social justice work. Actually, let me stop. Sorry, I'm getting too ahead of myself. Anyone have questions right now that they want to ask or statements they want to make? I've got my chat pulled up, so I'm trying to kind of peek back and forth, but any questions right now before I move on to the how? And I'll talk a little bit about some of those programs in more detail. Yes, this works starting pre-K. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. All right, so we'll get into the how, and then we'll have questions later. So Brian Stevenson's 4 keys to social justice work: get close, change the narrative, be willing to be uncomfortable, and give and receive hope. And all of my lesson planning, all of the work that I do really hinges on these 4 elements. So I'll give you a little bit of an idea for what you can do for each one. So when we talk about getting close, this really does mean building authentic relationships with community partners in schools with varying racial demographics. And if you're looking at other issues of social justice, or social injustice, I should say, you want to make sure that you are not just dealing with those issues from afar, that you are pressing into those communities, that you are learning from folks who are experiencing those injustices. And so getting close is key. Changing the narrative. Ensure that you're really analyzing how you're talking about the justice issue, and brainstorm ways to change any deficit language you use. think about the way we talk about things, because the way we talk about things drives the way that we feel about things. So I think this is a really important conversation to use when you talk to students. Here's this area of injustice. What words do we use to describe people who experience this injustice, for example? Next, be willing to be uncomfortable. So prepare your students for discomfort and tension, and be open about these feelings and talk about them and address them. You want to take them into unfamiliar territory, prepared for that territory. I talk about my African American Lit class and how students so often go through this period of grief, right? It's almost like white students go through the stages of grief. They're shocked, they're angry, they feel hopeless. And walking them through those feelings is a really important piece of their change. Now, a quick caveat, when we talk about segregated schools and school populations, we have to remember that when schools are racially predominantly white, that there are still students of color in that space. And we need to make sure we take extra care to ensure that those students of color are not being tokenized, are not looked to speak on behalf of all people of color. So in my African American Lit class, if there was a student of color in there, I made sure to have private conversations about that student, or I'm sorry, not about, with that student, to ensure constant check-ins, right? Opening the door to ensuring that if something happened in the class, he or she had an open access to me so that I could address that if I didn't address that in the classroom, so that I could apologize. So you do need to make sure that you're meeting the needs of the students of color who are existing in predominantly white spaces. And this work will help them, empower them to fight for change as well. I remember this amazing moment. We went into Collins Academy and one of my white students came out. We were sitting at lunch later on our way home. And she said, you know, excuse me, I ran back in to go to the restroom and I realized I was the only white person in a space. And that's never happened to me before. And I felt really uncomfortable suddenly. And another student of color who was sitting next to her said, that's my experience every day. And let me tell you about code switching. And they had this amazing breakthrough conversation where true empathy was shown from that white student. And they became really good friends. It was a beautiful thing. And finally, give and receive hope. Remember that justice work is everyone's work for everyone's good. And that hope will ultimately come from relationship building. White students sometimes carry a narrative or carry an identity of saviorhood, right? I must save. No, that is a burden we do not need to carry, right? That is a superiority complex that we do not need to bear. There's so much that we are missing out on when we hold that kind of burden. So justice work is everyone's work for everyone's good. It won't look the same for everybody. It won't look the same for your white students, but they have a specific role to play in this work. I have a tool for you. So this is the Social Justice Curriculum Planning Guide, and you can scan that QR code right there with your phone if you want. I know that Amanda's going to put this link in the chat, and when you also have a link to the slide deck, you can click on this. So it just helps you to kind of consider what area of injustice do you want to address, and then what are some things you can do to hit those 4 points, get close, get uncomfortable, change the narrative, and give and receive hope. And then it sort of helps you think about what are some resources that I have ready for at my hand, what are some resources I can attain, and what are my 30, 60, and 90-day actionable goals. All right, so this is for you. I encourage you to use it with teams in your school. I encourage you to use it on your own as you plan even your next lesson. My goodness, let's plan our next lesson using this guide. It'll be transformative. And what I want to share with you is some student testimonies, because I think the words of students are really powerful. And so, sorry about that. Let's look first at this. This was a college essay that one of my students who took African American Lit wrote. And he was a white boy, his name's Blake. And he said, the structures of my comfort zone began to crumble and eventually blow away like fine dust. But the amazing thing was that construction began immediately. Walls of compassion were built on foundations of newfound awareness and knowledge. Experiences and emotions became the cement filling this new mold. And as time went on and continues to do so, more area becomes engulfed by this new and complex arrangement of my ideals. It leads me to yearn to understand people different than me, to see individuals for who they really are and not for who society conditions me to believe. African American lit was bigger than I once believed. Looking back, it was never about just black and white. It was about taking off the tinted glasses placed so innocently on our eyes at a young age and being able to see each other for how we were made to be seen, as a human being. This is what happens to students when they walk through this work, because he starts with the anecdote about being afraid to stand up when he heard someone being called a racial slur. And then he talks about his transformation and what he would do differently now. Let's hear from Keaton as well. Oh.
Opportunities like the CARE conference or the civil rights tour we did are so important because I've found and I've learned that a lot of issues that we deal with stereotyping and racism and just discrimination in general have mostly to do with lack of exposure to various people and groups of people. And so opportunities like those give a good situation for students, and especially students that come from schools of low levels of diversity, to be exposed to different situations and different groups of people that they may normally not have access to. And it also oftentimes does it in a fun and entertaining way, in such a way that young students who maybe aren't the most enticed will perhaps latch onto it a little bit better. And so I think that's a great thing, or a great way that we've taken on issues like that. And I think that it needs to continue that way.
And you can do this. You can do this on Monday. You can start doing this on Monday. I started with teaching one film in my film class. You can start doing this now. But it won't be easy. And nothing good ever is. There will be trials. There will be struggles. And feel free to, my goodness, contact me, email me. Let me know if you need some support. I am here for you because this work matters. And I want to be here for you. And there will be trials. And there'll be some personal trials first. So there's a phenomenal article, and I've got it cited there at the bottom, that talks about the tensions that teachers experience when talking about equity. And so there's 3 tensions that we often experience. And I would love if you feel like, yes, that is the tension I'm experiencing right now, go ahead and put that tension in the chat, because I'm sure it fluctuates, right? We feel different tensions at different times. But as we do this work, we're going to feel personal tension, right? We're going to question our own readiness, our own abilities, how successful we can be. And ultimately, we will ask ourselves, what can I do? What can I do, right? That's that personal tension, right? So tell me if you're feeling that personal tension. What can I do? And if you're feeling that tension, be empowered. You can do a lot with just even one book, one lesson. I want you to go beyond that, but if that's where you need to start, that's okay, all right? Structural tension. You will feel structural tension, right? Questioning the power that we have to actually counteract any of these structural or societal problems. That key question is, what can I do? What can I do? This problem is so big. What can I do? And this is where understanding the history really comes in. If you know how, for example, your segregated communities were built through redlining, then you know the kind of policies that need to to be instituted or in order to change that, right? So that learning history is a great way to help mitigate structural tension. And finally, strategic tension. So we're often looking for concrete and actionable steps that we can take in our spaces, but we're not really sure what those are. So what can I do? What can I do, right? And I hope that template will really help you to deal with some of that. What can I do? I also have an amazing resource guide for you as well that I'll share. So put in the chat, what are you feeling right now? Are you feeling that personal tension? What can I do? Are you feeling that structural tension? What can I do? Or are you feeling that strategic tension? What can I do? Just identifying that and knowing that that's what you're feeling is actually really empowering and liberating, because you know maybe where you need to start. This article has been so liberating for me, especially when I feel stuck, right? When I feel like I can't go on. Well, what is it that I'm actually feeling, right? So put it in there. Let me know how you're feeling. Oh, this is good. Yes, I'm seeing it all already. Oh, yes. Thank you. Not just as a teacher, but as a dad, Justin. That's so vulnerable. I appreciate that so much. I feel that too. I feel that strategic tension a lot in motherhood, raising 4 white boys right now, right? And really feeling that strategic tension. I appreciate you naming that. So some thoughts to help you with those tensions. Do some personal work, right? This is a phenomenal article that how do I know if my biases affect my teaching? And then in this article is a link to various bias assessments. Just kind of uncover some of that dirt, right? Uncover some of that stuff and then deal with the tension that comes from that. Oh, I apologize. I just clicked on the article for you. Let me get back to share. There we go. I think I did it. Yes. Okay. So we'll just talk quickly about navigating tension from the outside and then hopefully have a few minutes for questions. So here's a few things I think you can do to navigate some of the tensions that we experience. First, anticipate the responses. Think about how you might respond to getting results from a bias assessment that show that you have unmitigated bias and you didn't think you did, all right? So think about that. Think about the possibility of that. Think about the response you might get from the community. Anticipating that prevents that surprise and really is helpful to keep you resilient and keep you going. Find your allies. This work is so difficult to do alone. Find even if it's one other person in your school district who's willing to come alongside you to be your accountability partner. Create a team of teachers who meet for coffee or drinks and discuss their lesson plan and discuss your lesson plans and your strategies. Find your allies. That's a huge, huge part of building resilience in this work. Over communicate. This was key. I communicated about everything. When I taught a film, I communicated why I was teaching. I sent home letters about why I was teaching it and permission slips about what I was teaching. I taught Do the Right Thing. So I sent home a whole letter about why I thought this was a critical film, the scenes that I would leave out to ensure that students weren't exposed to anything traumatic. All right, over communication is really, really key. I let my principal know, hey, I'm showing this film, here's the letter I'm sending. I just want you to know so that you're not blindsided if you get a phone call. Over communicate. I think that's a really helpful way to mitigate problems because you're already starting by saying, hey, I'm doing this really amazing thing. Here's why it's amazing. I want you to participate in it as a parent, as an administrator. Come watch this with us. Come participate in this conversation. Invite people in to this conversation who might be resistant, and you will help to mitigate some of that tension. Make good press. I like to joke that my husband is my press agent. He was constantly, whenever we did work on a larger scale, he was calling the local radio station, the local television station, being able to say, hey, check out this really cool thing that Mount Vernon is doing, getting ahead of that. I mean, it's tactical. Get ahead of that press cycle, right? Get ahead of it. Talk about how amazing the work that you're doing is before anyone has a chance to talk about how people are angry about the work that you're doing. I think that's a really, really good strategy. And finally, know your facts. If you're teaching about equity, know what equity means. If you're teaching about diversity or oppression, know what those words mean. Know your data. Know exactly what you're trying to address through these lessons. Be armed with that knowledge. And stand firm in your why. Know why you're doing this so that you can communicate that clearly to anybody who asks. So anticipate the response, find your allies, over communicate, make good facts. No, make good press. We don't make facts, right? Know your facts and stand firm in your why for this work. This is one more testimony that we're going to skip, but I really encourage you to watch it when you get the slide deck. Lily has some amazing things to say, but because we're a little short on time, we're going to pass over that one. Here's my present to you. I'm really excited about this. So you've got two things here. This is just a guide for some books that I might recommend, and all of these are clickable links. And then pre-age aligned resources for your classroom. So we have, you can see it right there, pre-K through second, third through fifth, sixth through eighth, and ninth through 12th, resources that you can use right now in your classroom to teach about race in schools. These are yours. You can share them. You'll have the links in the slide deck. These are clickable, and I think Amanda is going to put the link in there right now as well. And I have my consulting company right there. If you need anything, just really please reach out. Okay. That's where I'm at. I think we have about 5 minutes. Yes, exactly 5 minutes to take questions. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. Take those questions. Feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question you want to ask, or put a question in the chat.
I had my hand raised.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, sir. I didn't even see it.
Oh, that's okay. But I just want to say something really quick, and then I'll get other people, because, you know, what you're doing is stuff that I've done. I'm a retired teacher now, but I substitute teach. But you utilize the NEA Foundation. You can get a lot of good grants from them, and it can enable you to do some of these things. And one thing I wanted to share with you, you know, just to emphasize, you know, don't be surprised if you're going to have problems. In First Peter, it says, "Why are you surprised when these trials come upon you?" Mm-hmm. And you know, like I worked in a lot of things with social justice, and I worked as a librarian in a prison, actually. And prisons aren't always the most progressive places in terms of that type of thing. But I got you know, people behind me and did a lot of neat things, and it was really good to see what happened there. So I just wanted to share with you. Don't be surprised if this happens, but be good in your resolve that you know that this is something that needs to be done. So that's all I have to say. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. And thank you for your work. That's really encouraging, and I appreciate that. And Chuck is totally right. NEA has some great resources, grants you can apply for. Even just think you want a new set of books, or you want to be able to take your students somewhere, reach out to your community. We had so much funding just come in from putting a letter in the newspaper saying what we were doing, that we were taking a trip to the U.S. South to explore how the civil rights movement worked there, and we raised almost $10,000 from people just sending in donations for us to be able to give scholarships to students. So people are ready to support you in this work. So absolutely, thank you for that. Other questions? Or yeah, feel free to unmute. I love seeing you. I wish we were in person. I love seeing your faces and seeing your questions in the chat. So anything else?
Leanne, I'm wondering if you have advice specifically on that sort of bystander effect. Like I was thinking about a couple of years ago, my son was in third grade when COVID had just started. And he talked about overhearing an older student call an Asian American student coronavirus, right? And I was like, well, what did you do? And he was like, well, I didn't do anything. I didn't know what to do, right? It broke my heart. So I'm just wondering if you have thoughts on how we help, you know, white students in particular. And it's even harder when it's a teacher, right? Like both my kids have talked about seeing a teacher treat a Black student differently than a white student for the same kind of behavior. Like, how do we help them do something instead of just see it and feel bad about it and then tell their parents then?
Yeah, that's such a good question. Thank you, Justin. We practice that in my classes. We actually practice what to say, and that ends up being really helpful. And we take a pact that we as a class, now I always say to them, now you can't unknow what you know. So if you're not going to say something, you're making a choice. You're making a choice. And so we take a pact to say something, even if it's just, hey, that's not cool. because that's incredibly meaningful. And if it's a teacher, they come to me and I'll help them. We go together to administration. And that's certainly not easy, but when you can encourage your students to do it together as a team, it becomes a lot easier. And this is, we talked about, we would come back and share, I don't know if this is the right thing to do or not, but students would come back and share about what they've heard and how they stood up for people. And we would celebrate that, right? And not celebrate that thing happened, but really be able to say, yes, this is good. How did this work? What did this feel like? How can we do it better next time, right? Really take that apart and do it as a team, because then they're not feeling like they're doing it in isolation. And what happens is when they hear that in the hallway, they're no longer just accountable to themselves. Right? They're accountable to the other people that they took that oath with, made that pact with, and to the people of color that they've built relationships with, right? It's easy to not say anything when you don't know anybody that those words are hurting. So I hope that was helpful. That's a hard one though.
All right, Leanne, thank you so much for this session. It is 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock Eastern time, 1 o'clock where I am. And we do have to end on time because we have a 10-minute break here before we get into our next session. So thank you so much. Great conversation.
Thank you all so much. Have a great day. Enjoy the rest of the conference.